China's $2 billion gamble, how BYD plans to outmaneuver Trump's tariff wall through Mexico. The global order that Washington has carefully constructed over decades is, well, beginning to show cracks. In a move that signals a dramatic shift in economic power dynamics, China is collaborating with Mexico to revive a massive electric vehicle manufacturing project, a facility that could fundamentally reshape the automotive landscape across the Americas. With potential investment reaching $2 billion and an annual production target of 150,000 electric vehicles, this isn't just another factory. It represents Beijing's calculated response to American protectionism, a strategic maneuver designed to secure access to one of the world's most valuable consumer markets, while, at the same time, establishing dominance in the rapidly expanding Latin American region. The question on everyone's mind is straightforward yet complex. Why was this ambitious project halted in the first place? And now that discussions have resumed, what forces will try to stop it again? The rise of China's electric vehicle empire. Well, to really understand what's happening today, we need to examine how China became the undisputed leader in electric vehicle manufacturing. This transformation, didn't happen overnight. It was the result of sustained government investment, technological innovation, and, honestly, some pretty aggressive market expansion strategies that Western nations either underestimated or chose to ignore until it was, well, too late. By the end of 2023, Chinese manufacturers had already shipped 1.6 million electric vehicles to markets around the world. That figure alone was staggering, representing a level of industrial capacity that took Western automakers by surprise. But the real shock, honestly, came 12 months later. In 2024, China's EV exports surged to 2.3 million units, claiming the top position globally and leaving traditional automotive powerhouses like Germany, Japan, and the United States scrambling to respond. This explosive growth wasn't accidental. For over a decade, Beijing had been methodically building the infrastructure, supply chains, and technological foundation necessary to dominate the electric vehicle revolution. While Western governments debated climate policy and legacy, automakers hesitated to abandon their profitable internal combustion engine businesses. Chinese companies were pouring resources into battery technology, electric drivetrains, and cost-efficient manufacturing processes. The results, well, they speak for themselves. Chinese electric vehicles aren't just cheaper, they're technologically competitive, often matching or even exceeding the features found in vehicles costing twice as much from European or American brands. This combination of affordability and innovation created a powerful value proposition that resonated with consumers worldwide, from Europe to Southeast Asia, from the Middle East to Latin America. The Western backlash, tariffs as economic weapons. But success on this scale inevitably triggers defensive responses, especially when it threatens established economic interests. As Chinese electric vehicles began flooding global markets, alarm bells started ringing in Washington, Brussels, and Ottawa. The concern wasn't just about competition, it was about strategic vulnerability. The fear that allowing Chinese dominance in the automotive sector could create dependencies that would be, honestly, pretty difficult to reverse. In May 2024, the United States fired the first major salvo in what would become an escalating trade confrontation. The Biden administration announced a comprehensive 100% tariff on all electric vehicles manufactured in China. The official justification centered on claims of unfair subsidies, the argument that Beijing was artificially supporting its EV industry through massive government funding, creating an unlevel playing field that made genuine market competition impossible. 4 months later, Canada followed suit, implementing identical tariff policies in September 2024. The message from North America was clear. Chinese electric vehicles, regardless of their quality or price, would face punitive barriers that would effectively price them out of reach for most consumers. For Chinese manufacturers, the impact was immediate and severe. Export costs skyrocketed. Vehicles that had been attractively priced suddenly became uncompetitive. Consumers who had been considering Chinese EVs for their advanced features and reasonable pricing found themselves pushed toward more expensive Western alternatives. The carefully constructed market penetration strategies that Chinese companies had developed suddenly faced an insurmountable obstacle. But Western policymakers understood something fundamental about economic competition in the 21st century. It's easier to prevent dependence than to break it once established. Even if these tariff policies meant sacrificing some degree of market efficiency and consumer choice, in the short term, they were deemed necessary to prevent a scenario where Western economies became structurally reliant on Chinese automotive technology and manufacturing. China's counter-strategy: manufacturing goes global. Chinese companies, however, had no intention of simply accepting defeat. If Western nations wanted to block vehicles manufactured in China, the solution was, honestly, elegantly simple: manufacture them somewhere else. The strategy wasn't about changing the brand or the technology. It was about changing the country of origin printed on the customs documentation. This tactical shift led to a wave of overseas manufacturing investments by Chinese EV companies, with BYD, one of the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturers, leading the charge. The company's global expansion strategy became a case study in how to navigate the complex intersection of trade policy, geopolitics, and market access. One of BYD's most significant moves came in Brazil, where the company acquired a former Ford manufacturing facility in Bahia State. This wasn't just a real estate transaction. It represented BYD's first major production base in Latin America, a region with enormous growth potential and relatively open trade policies. By manufacturing vehicles in Brazil, BYD could sidestep American tariff restrictions entirely while simultaneously positioning itself to serve the entire South American market, a region of over 400 million consumers. The Brazilian facility offered multiple strategic advantages. Labor costs were competitive. Raw materials were available locally or through regional trade networks. And crucially, vehicles manufactured there would be classified as Brazilian products, not Chinese ones, at least from a customs and tariff perspective. But BYD's ambitions extended far beyond the Americas. In July 2024, the company signed a landmark agreement with Turkey's government to construct a state-of-the-art electric vehicle manufacturing complex in Manisa, an industrial hub in western Turkey. The initial investment was pegged at approximately $1 billion, with projected first-year output reaching 150,000 vehicles annually. Turkey wasn't chosen randomly. The country occupies a unique position in global trade architecture, maintaining a customs union with the European Union that allows certain manufactured goods to move freely between Turkish and EU territories without additional tariffs. If BYD's Turkish facility could begin operations as planned by the end of 2026, it would create a pathway for Chinese-branded vehicles to enter European markets while avoiding the trade restrictions specifically targeting China-manufactured imports. The pattern was becoming clear. Chinese EV manufacturers were constructing a global manufacturing network designed specifically to circumvent Western tariff walls. It was economic judo, using the complexity of international trade rules to turn Western protectionism against itself. But Western governments, particularly in Washington, were learning to anticipate these moves. When Donald Trump returned to the White House on January 20th of this year for his second presidency, he brought with him a renewed commitment to aggressive trade intervention and, honestly, an even more confrontational approach to Chinese economic competition. The Trump administration's strategy went far beyond the tariffs implemented during the Biden years. This was a comprehensive assault on Chinese participation in the American automotive market, combining multiple policy instruments to create what some analysts have described as an economic blockade. Import tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles were sharply increased. Restrictions were placed on the import and export of critical components, targeting the supply chains that Chinese manufacturers relied on. And perhaps most dramatically, the administration began floating proposals to outright ban certain Chinese EV brands from selling in American markets, regardless of where they were manufactured. The underlying logic was straightforward. If Chinese companies thought they could simply manufacture vehicles in third countries to avoid tariffs, Washington would close that loophole with policies targeting the corporate ownership and technology origins, not just the manufacturing location. This escalating trade conflict directly threatened what had been shaping up as one of BYD's most ambitious projects, a massive electric vehicle manufacturing complex in Mexico. Throughout 2024, BYD had been methodically advancing plans for a major manufacturing presence in Mexico. The company had identified 3 potential states for the facility, conducting detailed feasibility studies and engaging in negotiations with state and federal officials. Northern Mexican states emerged as frontrunners in the site selection process. These regions already hosted substantial automotive manufacturing operations from companies like General Motors, Ford, and Volkswagen. The existing infrastructure, skilled workforce, established supplier networks, logistics capabilities, made them natural choices for a major new EV facility. Central Mexico, particularly areas near Mexico City, also remained under consideration. While lacking some of the automotive infrastructure of the northern states, these locations offered advantages in terms of access to Mexico's domestic market and connections to the country's broader logistics network. According to BYD's internal projections, the facility would start with an annual production capacity of 150,000 vehicles. But that was just the beginning. Within several years, the plant was expected to scale up to between 400,000 and 500,000 vehicles annually, making it one of the largest EV manufacturing facilities in the Western Hemisphere. The strategic calculus was compelling. Mexico maintains extensive trade agreements with the United States, most notably the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement that replaced NAFTA. Products manufactured in Mexico could, theoretically, enter American markets with minimal tariff barriers. For BYD, this represented a golden opportunity to access North American consumers while avoiding the punitive tariffs applied to China-manufactured vehicles. But Trump's return to power changed everything. Within weeks of his inauguration, the president made clear that his administration would not tolerate what he characterized as Chinese companies using Mexico as a backdoor into American markets. Import tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles were pushed even higher, reaching 104%. But more significantly, Trump issued direct warnings about vehicles manufactured in Mexico by Chinese-owned companies. The president threatened tariffs as high as 200% on electric vehicles produced in Mexican facilities controlled by Chinese corporations. And he didn't stop there. The administration suggested that these punitive tariffs might be expanded to cover other Mexican exports to the United States, essentially threatening Mexico's entire export economy if the country facilitated Chinese market access strategies. This created an impossible situation for BYD. The whole point of manufacturing in Mexico was to avoid American tariffs. But if vehicles made in Mexico would face tariffs of 200%, the economic logic collapsed entirely. Under intense pressure from Washington, the Mexican government began to reverse its position on Chinese automotive investment. Officials made clear that Mexico would no longer offer the incentive packages and subsidies that had been part of earlier discussions with BYD. Land grants were canceled. Tax incentives were withdrawn. Some Mexican officials even made public statements explicitly saying that Mexico had no interest in becoming a pathway for Chinese electric vehicles to circumvent American trade policies. But the real turning point came in September 2025. The Mexican government announced new tariff policies targeting imported vehicles and automotive components, with rates reaching 50%. While officially described as measures to protect domestic manufacturing and employment, most industry observers interpreted this as a direct response to American pressure. a policy specifically designed to make it economically unviable for Chinese companies to use Mexico as a manufacturing base for exports to the United States. Faced with this combination of American threats and Mexican policy shifts, BYD had little choice. The company formally announced that it was suspending its plans for the Mexican manufacturing facility. The $2 billion project that had been months away from breaking ground was indefinitely shelved. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Less than a year later, Mexico's position appears to be shifting once again. Recent statements from both BYD executives and Mexican officials suggest that the project may be back on the table, raising fundamental questions about Mexico's willingness to continue subordinating its economic interests to American political demands. This past November, a senior vice president at BYD made a significant public statement at a major trade exhibition in Guadalajara, which is, one of Mexico's most important industrial cities. The executive revealed that BYD is actively reconsidering its Mexican manufacturing plans, with an official announcement expected before the end of 2025. The statement was carefully worded, making clear that significant obstacles remain. The most critical issue is, the tariff question. BYD is currently engaged in intensive negotiations with Mexican government officials over potential exemptions from the 50% import tariff on vehicles and components. Without resolution on this issue, the economics of the project simply don't work. But the fact that these discussions are happening at all represents a remarkable shift. It suggests that Mexico may be recalculating the costs and benefits of aligning completely with American trade policies, particularly when those policies require Mexico to turn away billions of dollars in foreign investment. Why Mexico matters so much? To understand why Chinese companies remain so determined to establish manufacturing operations in Mexico despite the political complications, we need to examine the multiple strategic advantages the country offers. The most obvious factor is geographic proximity to the United States. Despite all the political rhetoric and policy barriers, the United States remains one of the world's most valuable automotive markets. American consumers purchase millions of vehicles annually, and the shift toward electric vehicles is accelerating. Any company with serious ambitions in the global EV market needs a strategy for accessing American consumers, even if that access is limited or expensive. But Mexico offers something even more valuable than geographic proximity. It offers resource access. The country sits atop some of the world's most significant mineral deposits, particularly resources that are absolutely critical for electric vehicle manufacturing. Mexico is one of the world's leading producers of silver, a metal that plays an essential role in high-precision electronic components found throughout modern vehicles. The country also produces substantial quantities of copper. And electric vehicles require far more copper than traditional gasoline-powered cars, due to the extensive wiring needed for battery systems and electric motors. Perhaps most importantly, Mexico has significant lithium deposits. Lithium is the cornerstone of modern battery technology, the element that makes high-capacity, rechargeable batteries possible. And battery technology is precisely where Chinese companies have developed their most significant competitive advantages. By establishing manufacturing facilities in Mexico, Chinese EV companies could essentially position their factories directly on top of their raw material sources. Minerals could be extracted, processed, and integrated into vehicles all within the same country, dramatically reducing transportation costs, supply chain complexity, and vulnerability to international shipping disruptions. From a strategic supply chain perspective, this is enormously valuable, and it helps explain why Chinese companies view Mexico not just as a market access point, but as a long-term strategic asset worth fighting for. There's also the flexibility factor. Even if restrictions on entering the American market remain severe, a Mexican manufacturing base would still provide enormous value. Latin America as a whole represents a rapidly growing EV market, and manufacturing locally would allow Chinese companies to serve that market efficiently. The growth numbers from Latin America are striking, In 2024 alone, electric vehicle sales across the region doubled compared to the previous year, while overall EV penetration rates remain relatively low, meaning most vehicles on Latin American roads are still gasoline-powered. The growth trajectory is among the steepest anywhere in the world. This represents exactly the kind of emerging market opportunity that Chinese companies have proven exceptionally skilled at capturing. The opposition? Who's fighting back? But BYD's Mexican ambitions face fierce opposition from multiple directions, and understanding these opposing forces is crucial to assessing whether the project can ultimately succeed. Mexican automotive parts suppliers represent one significant source of resistance. These companies fear that if BYD establishes a major manufacturing operation in Mexico, the company will import most components directly from China rather than sourcing them locally. Even worse, from their perspective, BYD might establish its own component manufacturing facilities near the main assembly plant, creating a vertically integrated operation that cuts local suppliers out entirely. This concern is grounded in observable patterns. Chinese manufacturers often prefer to work with established supply chain partners, companies they've developed relationships with over years or decades. And given the efficiency and cost advantages that Chinese component manufacturers have developed, there's a strong economic logic to importing parts rather than building new supplier relationships in unfamiliar markets. For Mexican suppliers, this scenario represents an existential threat. If Chinese EV manufacturers capture a significant share of North American automotive production while simultaneously bringing their own supply chains with them, Mexican component manufacturers could find themselves marginalized in their own country. American automotive companies represent another powerful opposition bloc. With the notable exception of Tesla, American EV manufacturers have struggled to compete effectively against Chinese rivals. Companies like Rivian, Lucid, and traditional automakers trying to transition to electric vehicles have faced persistent challenges with production costs, battery technology, and achieving the scale necessary to compete on price. The market dynamics make the threat clear. Tesla has established a dominant position in the premium EV segment through a combination of technological innovation, brand appeal, and first-mover advantages. But in the mass market segments where most consumers operate, Chinese manufacturers, led by BYD, have demonstrated an ability to deliver competitive products at price points American companies simply cannot match. If BYD establishes significant manufacturing capacity in Mexico and gains access to North American markets, even with some tariff burdens, it could deliver a devastating blow to second-tier American EV companies that are already struggling to achieve profitability. These companies understand that they cannot compete head-to-head with Chinese manufacturing efficiency, and their survival depends on maintaining protective barriers that limit Chinese market access. The decisive factor: Mexico's calculus. Yet despite all this opposition, the ultimate decision doesn't rest with Mexican suppliers or American car companies. The decisive factor is the position of the Mexican government, and that's where the calculation becomes genuinely complex. From Mexico's perspective, a $2 billion manufacturing facility from one of the world's leading EV manufacturers represents an extraordinarily attractive opportunity. The direct economic impacts alone would be substantial. Thousands of jobs, significant tax revenue, technology transfer, and enhanced manufacturing capabilities. But the indirect effects could be even more significant. A major BYD facility would likely attract suppliers, both Mexican and international, creating a cluster effect that could transform an entire region into an EV manufacturing hub. It would provide practical experience with advanced manufacturing techniques that could benefit other Mexican industries. And it would help Mexico develop capabilities in processing and utilizing its own mineral resources rather than simply exporting raw materials. This represents exactly the kind of value-added industrial development that developing economies seek. Rather than remaining locked into extractive industries that provide relatively few high-skilled jobs, Mexico could move up the value chain, capturing more of the economic value created from its natural resources. The project would also strengthen Mexico's position as a critical node in global automotive supply chains, providing leverage and influence that extends far beyond this single factory. Against these substantial benefits, Mexico must weigh the risks of antagonizing the United States, by far its largest trading partner, and a nation that has demonstrated willingness to use economic coercion to achieve political objectives. A calculated bet on economic sovereignty. My assessment, based on analyzing the strategic incentives and economic fundamentals, is that BYD has a strong probability of successfully restarting this project. The economic logic is simply too compelling for Mexico to ignore indefinitely, regardless of American political pressure. Mexico faces a fundamental choice about its economic future. It can continue positioning itself primarily as a manufacturing extension of the United States, accepting American political demands even when they conflict with Mexico's own economic interests. Or it can begin asserting greater economic sovereignty, pursuing investment opportunities and trade relationships based on Mexican interests rather than American preferences. The fact that serious discussions about reviving the BYD project are happening suggests that Mexican policymakers may be moving toward the latter approach.